Buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this important event on the key ways to accelerate economic growth in an inclusive way in Latin America and the Caribbean. This topic is even more important when you look at the risks for 2023 and the economic impact of inflation, the war in Ukraine, and the impacts of the pandemic. I'm Jason Marzak, Senior Director of the Adrian Arsh Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. I invite everyone to participate in the event today using our hashtag ProactiveLAC. I'd like to start by welcoming our regional experts, panelists who are accompanying us today. Bill Maloney, Chief Economist for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank. Hi, Bill. Thank you for being here. Miriam Yepes, Director for Economic Intelligence and Tax Optimization at the Ministry of Economy and Finance of Peru. Welcome. Natalia Del Cogliano, Subsecretary of Entrepreneurial Development at the Secretariat of Industry and Productive Development at Argentina's Ministry of Economy. Welcome. Alan Plummer, National Director for Entrepreneurial Development at the Secretary of Industry and Productive Development, again, Argentina's Ministry of the Economy, and Andres Choi, President of the Latin American Confederation of Associations of Markets, Kiosks, Stores, and Bodegas. Welcome, Andres. I'd also like to thank Coca-Cola for supporting our work on economic reactivation and development in the region. At the Atlantic Council, we are pleased to have collaborated with Coca-Cola, among other private sector leaders, in fostering regional prosperity. Today's discussion focuses on a range of important topics, general topics such as the economic outlook for the region in 2023, as well as specific key issues for the economic future of our countries. For example, tax policy and the importance of small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. Today's event is also launching two new and important ALEC publications. One on taxes with the title Improving Tax Policy in Latin America and the Caribbean, a Balancing Act, by Felipe Larraín, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Chile and former Treasury Ministry of Chile, and very importantly, a member of the ALAC Advisory Council. The other author was Pepe Zhang, Associate Director and Fellow at our center. The other publication is on SMEs, Unlocking SME Potential in Latin America and the Caribbean, authors Eva Lartizabal and Pepe Zhang. The report on tax reform is especially important now, given the debates going on right now about tax reform in the region. Since the beginning of the pandemic, 13 tax reforms have been proposed in the region's 6 largest economies. Specifically, the report provides recommendations on how governments can best meet and balance economic policy goals that seem to be incompatible, but are actually strongly linked: economic growth, social equity, and increased tax collection. In general, tax and economic policy are vital to empowering SMEs and encouraging their growth as they face a number of challenges. They account for more than 60% of employment and make up 90% of the region's companies, and they're the focus of the second publication, which seeks to enhance the financial, technical, and digital capabilities of SMEs. Specific actions and a focus on the future of SMEs are very important, not only for SMEs, but for economic sustainability in general in the region. The two reports and this event are part of our series known as Proactive LAC, whose objective it is to provide expertise and recommendations to the countries of the region so that they can emerge stronger from the pandemic and develop even further. The next year is going to be important in terms of the thinking and actions that will serve to advance economic growth at a moment that is of such key importance for the region and the world. And with that, I will give the floor to our Associate Director and Fellow at ALAC, Pepe Zhang, who will guide the rest of the conversation. Pepe, on to you. Thank you, Jason, and to all the panelists accompanying us today to discuss these issues. We made the very strategic decision to hold this event on a day where there are no World Cup games going on. Thank you very much for your participation in this panel. As Jason alluded to, we'll be covering a whole range of topics in today's conversation, but we're going to start with macro outlook-based questions and then zoom in on SMEs and tax policy. So we'll start with a tough question first for Bill Maloney, Chief Economist for Latin America and the Caribbean at the World Bank. It's a question that really highlights the approach of our center. Bill, I wanted to ask you about 2023. And it's a two-part question. The first part is whether you could share with us what your economic projections are for the coming year. What are the main opportunities or engines of growth that you've identified for the region? That could be trends, sectors, countries. And then the second part of the question has to do with the challenges Jason referred to. Of all the economic challenges threatening our region at this time, what do you find most concerning for the coming year, and how can the region face those challenges? Thank you, Pepe. I'm going to answer your questions in reverse order. So I'll start with the challenges. As we all know, we're coming out of a year that was better than we had hoped for with 3% growth. But the coming year may see headwinds. Interest rates, particularly in the US, have been increased considerably, which of course has an impact on interest rates in our countries. It makes it difficult to manage the debt accumulated during the pandemic. Commodity prices, which helped buoy some countries last year, are now on the decline. The performance among the G7, which is also a key variable for understanding performance, isn't doing so well, in part because of the war in Ukraine, energy shortages. Growth in China is another key factor. And there too, there is uncertainty, as we heard in recent days. China is abandoning its highly restrictive COVID policies, but we don't know by how much. And that could have a major impact on how the next year plays out, and specifically on commodity prices. And there's the reaction of the United States and the other industrialized countries in terms of interest rates. Now, the good thing is that we're doing a decent job of handling this. Managing inflation, most countries of the region have a decent level. We're not looking at runaway inflation. The central banks reacted swiftly and firmly, more so than the Fed, and that's had its impact. Markets are seeing high debt levels, yes, but they're cautious but not too concerned. The spreads are more or less where they were pre-COVID. So we're okay. We're better in terms of reserves, better off in terms of composition of the debt, US dollar denominated debt, and our financial sectors are healthier than they were in the past. So the outlook in terms of resilience is decent. It's not so bad, but growth, we're looking at 1.6% and perhaps the following year, 1.5%. It is partially due to COVID, but it's like what we saw during the 2010s, where we saw growth around 2%. So I think the problem is mediocre growth, despite the resiliency that's been shown. That's why we'll have to focus on growth opportunities. Looking at the medium term and the shifting landscape of there's the green economy worldwide. That gives us great opportunities that we will need to capitalize on. We have the greenest power grid in the world, with 50% of our energy being generated based on renewables. And that means that when the advanced countries impose restrictions on carbon content, will be well positioned. We will be able to demonstrate that we have green energy sources. Another opportunity lies in the wind and solar and green hydrogen energy forms. It's just an issue of technology coordination among various actors. We need to attract outside investors, but there is a significant opportunity there. We have more lithium and copper than many other parts of the world do. And so if we manage that well, that can help drive our economies as well. So I think with that, my 3 minutes are up, and I'll give it back to you. Thank you, Bill. So some of the items you touched on, first of all, resilience, the importance of bearing in mind that the regional economies have proven to be resilient, but on the other hand, those growth figures are none too impressive. And that's kind of like pre-pandemic when they weren't too impressive either. So we need to look for new drivers of growth in the medium term. And later in the conversation, we'll talk to you about the issue of productivity. You're a specialist, and it's an important topic for many countries of the region. I see that Natalia agrees. So I'd like to come down a little bit from the macro level, moving towards the micro level and companies. All these challenges and opportunities that Bill has outlined for us, how do they influence the daily business of businesses, especially SMEs? So now I have the next question for Andres, who can help us with that. He's the president of the Latin American Confederation of Associations of Markets, Kiosks, Stores, and Bodegas, the AKTB. The question is, looking at the outlook, looking ahead to the next year and taking into account what Bill has said, what opportunities and challenges do SMEs face during this time of great uncertainty? And is there any particular concern for the business owners you work with?
Thank you, Pepe, and thank you all for the invitation. The truth is, there's a great deal of concern. And SMEs in our sector, which is commerce, every day working with people in the neighborhoods and communities, we've seen many concerns. The economic situation, while we are seeing some encouraging developments at the level of micro and small businesses. Things are still difficult. There's a great deal of pressure. We've seen an increase in unemployment, and purchasing power because of inflation has dropped. The price of goods has skyrocketed because of increased inflation, especially in the case of exchange rates. We saw a crisis with the containers at the beginning of the year, substantial increases in prices. We're hearing talk now of lower agricultural production, which could force prices up as well. In the specific case of Peru, prices of goods have increased more than what we're hearing from the regulatory agencies and authorities. For example, just basic goods have grown. If we look at Argentina, what they've talked about prices, the MSMEs, there simply isn't enough. There have been negotiations with store owners to make sure that they have enough supply to take care of the neighborhoods where they work. We're seeing similar situations in Colombia. We're very concerned in many countries in the region. The price hikes are very concerning and makes it more difficult for repurchases of products. We've lost a lot of money. We don't have enough to be able to buy the goods to then resell them. In the case of producers and agriculture, there's a lot of competition. And so some have been forced to shut down. As far as 2023 is concerned, we are hearing talk of the possibility of a global recession. This is quite alarming for those of us where we are in the value chain selling the product. So it's not a very encouraging landscape for us. We've made some adjustments and there are fewer losses, but we're not entirely sure what is on the horizon. Thank you, Andres. I would love to hear Natalia weigh in and then Alan, but if you could just weigh in. It's very interesting to hear. It was important to hear the macro analysis, but then bring it down to the micro level and know what the day-to-day economic reality is for many small business holders. Some of the changes you're facing, challenges you're facing, not just inflation, but other issues that impact the work of small business holders. So we have Natalia from Argentina. I would like to hear your thoughts on the opportunities, the challenges, some of the trends we're seeing currently. How can SMEs grapple with these and other opportunities and challenges? And how is your ministry adapting to these new trends to better support SMEs? Thank you so much, Pepe. And thanks to those who spoke before me. I was listening very closely to what you were saying. I've taken note of some of what you've said. As the Undersecretary for Entrepreneurial Development in my ministry, I have to be optimistic, and I am optimistic. I have the great fortune of being able to work with entrepreneurs, business owners, people who have these undertakings and they're always trying to move forward. They're always looking toward the future. In the specific case of Argentina, I don't think I have to say much about the inflationary pressures we are under, so I'm not going to spend any time on that. Indeed, along the same lines with what Bill was saying, we are having difficulties with growth. We have to identify opportunities for growth, improve competitiveness, and make sure that we have good tools and instruments to make us more competitive and help in that way to reduce inflationary pressure. As far as opportunities for growth are concerned, in the ministry, we work with different instruments to create opportunities for entrepreneurs, those who have ideas, they have projects, or who have already opened businesses, small and medium-sized businesses. We want to really make sure that they are the ones galvanizing our economy, that they're the ones buoying in it. The green economy, of course, is important. Especially in a world that is making the transition to environmental sustainability, to energy transitions, to the transition to renewables and green energies. Of course, Argentina, it supports this. We are environmental creditors, as it were. We're working in terms of hydrocarbons, gas. We believe that in Argentina, we can help to hasten or at least contribute to the energy transition. Energy, whether conventional or renewables, are drivers of growth in Argentina. We want to make sure that we are developing the tools in the government so that we can support our business community in the entire value chain for renewable energies and other more traditional and conventional energies, which help us to leverage our movement toward a greener economy.
Los emprendimientos al desarrollo.
We are also looking to scale up enterprises in new industries, for example, medicinal cannabis. We just had a law passed on that. Electric vehicles, there is a new law in place. The current administration is pushing a more sustainable vehicle agenda. Our vehicles and electric vehicles are going to require more copper. That is going to become increasingly important. This is how we can contribute to a greener economy, a greener world through electric transport. In our agenda, these are important. The food sector, agrotech, biotech, the digital transition, digital transformation, the digital revolution. These are pillars of all the work we are doing in the Undersecretariat. We cannot lose sight of the fact that specific instruments need to also incorporate a gender perspective. There are a whole host of variables and pillars that underpin the work we do. They were outside the discussion in the past. We have to bring them in the transition to green economy. We have to level the playing field so that people like women can be entrepreneurs and have access to the same opportunities. So we're working on that right now. Pepe, I'm not sure if I went over my time. Thank you, Natalia, for bringing us through a discussion of some of the sectors where SMEs can have a direct impact, and some help where they help to strengthen the sector. For example, the energy sector, the food sector, and they help to buoy the economy in many ways. Thank you for your answer. I would like to turn the floor back to Bill. I promised before that I would talk to him about productivity. That's one of his areas of expertise, some of his day to day. I think there's a lot that we can bring productivity into the discussion of green economies, as Natalia stated. Like Natalia was also saying, the scalability of SMEs. In many cases, if they don't become more productive, they can't grow. Maybe, Bill, you could share some examples, some innovations being pushed by the World Bank and the multilateral support for SMEs. Could you highlight any initiatives that may exist? Productivity is a matter of concern in the region. Over 20 years, there was almost no growth in productivity. And all of the growth was more accumulation of capital, nothing more. To understand why that is the case, even in countries that have done everything they've needed to do, is truly puzzling for the region. There are two areas we need to take a look at. One has to do specifically with SMEs, and that's where I'll focus my comments. We have an agenda to encourage the business climate. When I talk to SMEs, particularly those that have to compete with imports from Asia, they talk specifically about financing. Yes, they can get very short-term loans, but if they want to invest in new machinery, they would need at least 4-year loan terms. In their countries, however, it is very difficult to access financing with terms like that. So reforms must be done. Laws on collateral, on liquidity, because that is what's preventing our financial markets from operating better. There's also a lack of capacity, a lack of capabilities of SME owners. I talked to 30 different SMEs in the auto parts sector in Colombia. In the World Management Survey, we've found that we are basically at the same level as India and Kenya as far as our business owners' capabilities, and maybe even be lower in India. This is because they have to grapple with new technology and new competitors. It's very difficult for them to put together strategies to truly boost productivity and change their mindset of how they survive. How are they going to compete directly with China? Here's where the bank has invested a lot in understanding technology extension investments or management extension, looking at ways for SMEs to improve their capabilities so they can better compete. In India, these programs can have major impact on productivity to the tune of 11% in a single year in some cases. They could also therefore have a significant impact on Colombia, even though it may not be as high as in India.
If we look, for example, at the history of Japan and Singapore, we see a lot of investment in this type of policy, and it's investing in entrepreneurial capabilities. And this together with financing, those two agendas together are key for our SMEs to grow more and to have more productivity. Thank you, Bill. The issue of productivity, financing, capacity building, these are all very important. Now, as we move to the second half of the discussion, I'd like to focus more on the issue of taxes. But I think as a transition, we can connect the dots. There are connections between SMEs and taxes. And so I want to turn to Miriam. Thank you for your patience. I think one of the challenges that many SMEs in the region face is the high tax burden, whether administrative or financial. So how can tax policy be improved to favor the growth and formalization of SMEs from the government perspective? We have high levels of informality and tax avoidance in the region, and this has an impact on the fiscal position of our country. So I want to ask you that, and then we can bring in Andres to talk about the perspective of entrepreneurs, and then perhaps go back to Natalia to share with us the government perspective. And we'll also love to hear from Alan, who's a great partner for the center. So we'll start with Miriam, who's the director for economic intelligence and tax optimization. So the floor is yours. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm going to start by noting that when we talk about SMEs, we're really talking about a very broad category. In Latin America, 90% of all companies fall into this category, but there's no clear definition of what it is. In Peru, a small business in Peru, if compared with a small business in Brazil, they're not the same thing. One is much larger than the other. So each countries have their own thresholds for purposes of access to certain programs, but there's no standard definition of a micro enterprise or small business or medium-sized business. And that's a problem because under this umbrella of SMEs, you have subsistence business, perhaps a street vendor, and at the same time, you might have a company with 100 employees and they're all SMEs. So when you're developing public policy to have an umbrella that's so vast, it just prevents you from targeting that policy. And as Bill said, we're seeing low productivity. But speaking of productivity with a company with 100 employees is not the same as productivity for a micro enterprise or a subsistence enterprise. So we have to be careful when using these definitions. And this is important when it comes to taxation, because this definition issue is important here as well. If you look at the statistics, you see that the tax burden in and of itself is not the problem, it's the cost of compliance. When we look at policies and see what different countries have done, including Peru, for smaller businesses in general, we see that there are 4 or 5 different tax regimes, and the fact that there are different systems often trying to reduce the tax burden, but what they've done in the end is increase the cost of compliance. And that's what most affects the most vulnerable companies. Because at least in Peru, they might have to pay 20 soles a month, but they have to hire an accountant to do it who charges 200 more. So the big problem for the smallest companies isn't the actual amount of tax. but the paperwork involved. And in a digital world, we now have some windows opening up. What we want in Peru, this is what we're working on, is to reduce the number of different systems, because the smaller the company it is, the more complicated it all seems. The complexity in and of itself reduces compliance. So it's important to take advantage of digital options. Many countries are doing this now. And it should be the tax administration that absorbs the costs of compliance. So the tax, because right now the taxpayer is having to come up with all the paperwork. But if they can provide receipts, then the tax administration could do the math, and that would reduce the cost of compliance faced by companies. It could be reduced to just a tenth of what they are right now. So that's the challenge, I believe, that public policy has to address. It doesn't have to be lower rates or tax holidays, because those of us who have worked on this at the ministry see that lower rates or tax holidays merely cause more informal activity, because then you don't have to have receipts. So instead, when we're talking about taxes and high rates, people get afraid, but it's not necessary. Policies have sought to reduce the rate in and of itself. We've already done that. Now we need to grow the tax base. We need more tax returns. We need better reporting of employees. We need a policy, a tax policy that creates incentives for filing tax returns. And that is an incentive to formalization. But that's when we're talking about the smallest businesses and the compliance costs they face. Thank you so much, Bill. I just want to confirm that I understand what you're talking about. I think we're talking about two different animals. When we talk about micro enterprises, they're often people with limited schooling. It's completely different from a company with 30 or 40 employees with a manager where they're seeking to expand. Those are different issues, and I think we should keep them separate. So in this conversation, we could perhaps be talking more about those who have 10 employees or more. Yeah, it is important to draw distinctions. The costs of compliance or non-compliance are important, and we talk about that in the paper because it is the smallest businesses that don't have that managerial capacity and that don't have the resources to hire somebody to support them and filing their returns. I'd like to give the floor now to Andres. Andres, can you tell us about the entrepreneur's perspective on this, and then we'll turn back to Natalia. Well, it's true that SMEs, that's a definition that varies from country to country. It's usually based on number of employees and not sales. Sometimes there are policies for SMEs in specific sectors. Even in one country, there can be disparities. There's a Peruvian SME, one could say that a medium-sized business in Peru is the same as a small business in a different country. But if I talk about Peru, I'd say that most are micro enterprises. They're very small, that are really operating for self-sustainability. Or bodegas, it's just sole proprietors. And then we have a single taxpayer system. In terms of support for micro and small enterprises, there are programs in place. The idea that we have to have programs for different segments, I'd say our government has done that already. Now, speaking of actual tax rates, it's not so much what the rate is, but how the system works. There are barriers to access to formality. The costs or barriers are increasing, actually. Micro and small enterprises find it very difficult to pay taxes. In Peru, we used to have a tax system with 5 categories. The system is quite inflexible, which means that even those who'd wish to formalize their businesses avoid doing so. So the government's attempts end up complicating things. So I suggest that there be a comparison of everything done by the government in terms of taxes. In our RUS system, you should just pay based on your turnover or sales, a certain amount. But if you, as a store, go over 8,000 soles in purchases, you automatically jump up into the next tax regime. And I think it's important to understand how our purchases work. When we buy, we stock up, and not everything we buy is sold in 1 month. So our purchases don't necessarily reflect our sales. So then you end up having to buy on the black market to keep your stock up so that you don't go over the 8,000 sol threshold. So what is needed is better dialogue with the government agencies responsible for tax policy so that they can see how it affects businesses, and so it can be improved. Because if you only look at macro figures, you don't see the big picture. You have to look at the micro level. Another thing is that you then get labeled as a tax evader, which can cause problems. Then there are fines, then 10% gets tacked on. So when there is a separation of issues, if you separate out tax policy and how it actually affects us on the ground, then I think it will become evident how you can facilitate compliance. Talking about sales, for instance, the consumer tax also makes products much more expensive, which also affects our sales levels. Right now, the selective consumer tax is so high and prices are skyrocketing. And again, people don't realize that it's not just the price of the product itself, that the tax comes on top of that. So this is something that needs to be analyzed. And all of this needs to be taken into account so as to formulate a better tax policy that will bring more people into the tax base.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was a very complete response. It is a privilege to have the perspective from somebody who's grappling with this on the day to day. I would like to see if Miriam would like to weigh in, or Alan or Natalia, if you want to talk about taxes versus SMEs. Miriam? I do think it's important, and based on what I said before, look at the types of businesses you're working with. The new RUS is a new type of tax. So the single taxpayer, these are people who are working at more at the subsistence rate. This was 98, it's about 20 sols, approximately. That's about $5. The tax system must go hand in hand with the way that companies are growing. It can't be that companies, that these businesses are just paying 20 sols over the life of their business. This new tax system, that is where we're trying to reach out to those in the informal economy. I wanted to make sure that that was understood. The tax system has to be consistent with the type of business that we're talking about. You cannot have the same tax regime for a very small or micro business as you do for a large company. Those are the adjustments that have to be made. Those of us who have worked and done studies with the IMF, the World Bank, and I think we all agree, this new tax system for subsistence level businesses. Something that's crystal clear to me based on what we've heard is that it's very important to engage more with the business owners so that the public and private sectors can have discussion about this, because oftentimes there are very striking differences in the positions, and these misunderstandings can be eliminated and can be handled. I will just be very brief and invite Alan to provide his own comment. In Argentina last year, and Alan, please correct me if I'm wrong, that the 66,000 companies were open. When we looked at their profile, indeed, these were individuals, self-employed, single taxpayers, or they were small businesses. And those companies that were created in 2021, 2 out of every 3 were just individuals, so self-employed, individual people who opened their own businesses, which was a self-employment situation. Alan can speak much more to this, but in the ministry, in our office, we're talking about a proposal to see how we as the government, in the case of enterprises, companies, it could be a self-employed individual or it could be an entity, and look at them for the first 7 years of the operations of the business. And this can be an SME. They would have to exist for 7 years to be considered a true enterprise that is based on Argentine law. That's the group we work with. We would like to do an analysis to see how we can simplify the system. When we ask ourselves, why do these individual entrepreneurs, people who are their own business, they're self-employed, but they don't formalize their business so that they can grow even more? What we've been seeing and what I discussed with Alan even before the meeting, we were looking at the agenda for today's event. We were talking about administratively how costly it is for entrepreneurs or business people to take that final step to formalize. If we look at large consolidated companies and see how they managed, we want to look at some of the basics to make sure that these companies and these enterprises and undertakings are more grounded, more professional. So in Argentina, as happens in Peru, what we want to do is have a denser business universe. That is the challenge. We have many who are in the initial phases. We want these companies to start up. We want them to be able to develop, but we also have many businesses that close in the second, third, or fourth year of existence. And we want to deal with that issue and try to prevent it from happening. Alan? Yeah, Natalia. And with what you and Bill were saying about productivity of companies, we found something interesting in recent weeks in some of the visits we made. The digital transformation is a major issue. Natalia visited a company, a business that, thanks to a subsidy that we provided, it was non-reimbursable. And the idea was to help this put this help this SME to develop. As far as the tax side is concerned, we think it's important, but we see this as something systemic. It's not just about regulations and taxes. We have to talk about business structures and work with business owners to help them be trained. It's like what Bill was saying. We have a platform, it's called Capacitar, which means training, where we train business people, entrepreneurs on business models to help their businesses be better. As Natalia was saying, 50% of Argentinian businesses are shut down before they reach 5 years. This brings other benefits. It can improve their credit rating and helps them to become more formal. And the more formal a business is, the more access to credit they have. We've seen increases in amounts that some of these businesses can access, and especially if they become formal companies, it makes that easier. We have to continue to work. We have to be selective as well. In Argentina, we need to create some sort of business discipline. We cannot reach out to every single business out there. So we have to reach out to those that are more dynamic and the ones that with the potential to create more jobs in the coming years. Thank you, Ellen. I think that comparison of the situation in different countries was very interesting. Obviously, there are different nuances, but I do think it's quite interesting. And Andres, like I was saying, it was very important to hear the perspective from the small business side. So now looking at the big picture and a more macro side of things, this is a question for Bill. It's about tax policy, but it goes beyond that. Fiscal policy, economic policy. I would love Bill to perhaps speak on this, and then maybe we'll close up about 5 minutes late. But just thinking out loud here. If we look at some of the different objectives of fiscal and economic policies, governments simultaneously have these objectives, which may seem to be at odds with each other. So you have growth, including continued support for the economy in difficult circumstances. Then we have fiscal discipline. We know that this is extremely important. The World Bank works very much in helping countries with fiscal discipline. But this can lead to a reduction in public expenditures and increases in revenues, which is something Miriam discussed. And last but not least, the matter of fairness and progressivity in taxation. We have seen some trends, some concerning trends in the region. How might these objectives, economic and tax policy objectives, how can they be advanced and how can we strike perhaps an optimal balance among them? Oh, Pepe. I think 5 minutes you can sum this up. I think it's a good question. We're having this discussion of resources for state, the need for revenues. We have a problem of lack of investment in public goods. And these are quite striking. And then the fiscal space. So the question is, how can we effectively and efficiently and progressively, because we also know that there are major issues of inequality in the region, how do we do this with little to no impact on growth? The World Bank has seen that there's literature in advanced countries, particularly the US, that's quite far reaching. But in Latin American countries, there is much less. They don't make the efforts. For example, right now, everyone is looking at rent increases. Our levels are much low, or income tax. If you look at income tax coverage in most countries, it's about 20%. The 20% richest, but in the US, it's 80% are paying this. So we are bringing in far less tax revenue through income tax. The impact is on a very, very small group. And they're the ones who invest. It's the business community. And that is perhaps why we're finding the impact on growth is 2 times worse than what we're seeing in the US. In this minute that I have, that we have a very bold agenda to address this impact through all of our instruments. So VAT, income taxes, property taxes, and we really have to move forward with that agenda. And I will leave it there. And thank you so much, Bill. I would like to extend I would like to invite you all to take a look at the report. There will be other reports from the World Bank that are very important. Miriam, I wanted to give you the last word when we talk about tax collection and some of the practical or technical steps you've taken. So how, when it comes to tax policy, how can you address these different challenges that we've said, bearing in mind what we've heard from Bill and from Alan? And that's quite a broad question. I'll go back to what Bill was saying. It is true that there are different studies that say that lower corporate taxes encourage investment. Now, this has been a terrible year for all of Latin America. And some where we see very low taxes in Peru, and there are 80% who are exempt from some of the taxes. So the idea is to, if you reduce corporate taxes, then you see the increase in income taxes, but it's not that straightforward. It's a political matter as well. Last year, there was a legislative decree to reduce the burden on those with higher incomes, but this is always sensitive. If you look at this globally, there's some difficulties, maybe less than we're seeing it less in Peru, but the OECD countries, they're the ones who those with higher incomes have a lower tax burden. That I'm talking about individuals here. But this is a major challenge that we face in Latin America.
Yo creo que una cosa que han destacado los dos, tanto usted como Bill, es que
Yes, thank you. Both you and Bill have highlighted something that sometimes solutions seem obvious or easy. You think, oh, we just need to lower the rate, but then it can actually be hard, and there's the political side. And in some cases, the political is as important or more than the economic. But I just want to close with 2 points. The importance of having someone on board who can provide us with the entrepreneurial perspective, which is what Andres was able to do for us today, because policy makers and are coming up with ideas, but it has to work on the ground. So that's really important. And second, there's the issue of equity, progressivity. We have to make public policy decisions that are evidence-based, where you do the math right. And a lot has been discussed about equity and progressivity and social terms, but in business terms, it's important too. Different sectors are treated differently. Maybe that's a subject for another day. So with that, and I apologize for having gone 2 minutes over, thank you to each and every one of our panelists for sharing their perspective. It's been a very interesting conversation, and you all complemented each other very well. Thank you, Natalia, Alan, Bill, Miriam, and Andres for this conversation. Huge thanks to everyone who helped us on the team, Eva, Jackson, Jacob. It's always a privilege to work with all of you. Thank you and good afternoon.
Gracias a todos.
Gracias.
Buenas tardes.